Hi everyone, welcome back to the Australian Rotary Health podcast called The Research Behind Lift the Lid. I'm Jessica Cooper, and today on episode 52, we will be talking to Dr. Ben Smith. Ben was awarded an Ian Scott PhD scholarship from Australian Rotary Health from 2011 to 2013 for his project Understanding the Psychosocial Impact of Surviving Testicular Cancer. Today, Dr. Ben Smith works at the Sydney Partnership for Health Education, Research and Enterprise, or SPHERE, where he is a senior research fellow within the Cancer Clinical Academic Group. Ben's research aims to ensure equitable access to high-quality evidence-based psychosocial cancer care for all people living with cancer. He has a particular interest in fear of cancer recurrence, digital health interventions, and underserved populations impacted by cancer, such as culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today, Ben. How's everything been going for you?
You're welcome. Yeah, not too bad given the current circumstances, but it's going well.
Yeah. No, that's all we can do. Just keep going and see what happens. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, thank you again for joining me. And it sounds like you have definitely come a long way in your career since completing your PhD, a few years ago now. So I guess before we get into what your project was about, can you give us a bit of a snapshot of what your career has been like since then and what you're working on currently?
Yeah, sure. No worries. I guess, it's been a little while since finishing my PhD, which is in about 2015. At that point, I took a position within the same research group. I was based at the Psycho-Oncology Cooperative Research Group at the University of Sydney, where I coordinated a nationwide trial of a therapist-delivered intervention for an issue called fear of cancer recurrence. It's essentially the worry or concern that so many cancer survivors have, that their cancer will come back after they finish treatment. So I worked on that for a couple of years, and that study produced some really fantastic results, which I guess has really launched my career in that space, along with my PhD work. I did have a brief kind of foray into the area of whether video games could improve the mental health of young men in the general population more broadly, but decided that cancer survivorship was really my main area of interest, and so I think it was in around 2018 I returned to work as a translational research fellow at the Centre for Oncology Education and Research Translation, where I was really focused on, I guess, trying to develop and implement interventions to improve the mental health and quality of life of cancer survivors, and make sure they were implemented in practice. And now that centre's kind of been subsumed into the SPHERE network. So I'm doing similar kind of work, but with a broader group of institutions and health districts to try and, I guess, implement that work at a broader level.
Yeah, well, it really sounds like you're really passionate about this area of improving the mental health of people with cancer. So it sounds like such an important area as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and your PhD project, I suppose it's a little bit unique because usually we fund projects that look specifically just at mental health, but yours is sort of extended to physical illness and how mental health sort of plays a part in that. And I guess you were looking particularly at people with testicular cancer. So I guess perhaps to start off, Why is it important to sort of consider psychological factors in patients who have experienced an illness or poor physical health?
Well, I think it's it's fairly well established now that physical illnesses, particularly ones that are life-threatening like cancer, can have a really huge impact on how people see themselves and where they see their life going. I mean, we certainly saw that in the work that I did focused on testicular cancer survivors. I mean, these are young men who have their sense of invincibility shattered by a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness like cancer. And it was something that came as a shock to the vast majority of the people that I spoke to. So I think it's important to acknowledge that that can have a really life-altering impact, particularly if it's something that does happen at a young age. And we know that a person's physical and mental health are quite interrelated, and that if a person's experiencing poorer mental health, then that can often impact on their physical outcomes as well. So, I mean, for instance, we know that fear of recurrence, which, as I mentioned, is one of the issues that my research is focused on, can lead people to avoid attending kind of routine cancer screening, such as mammograms in the case of breast cancer, that can play a really important role in detecting cancer recurrence. So physical issues. So I think that just shows the important connection between mental and physical health, and I think it's important to consider the two together when we're especially when we're talking about the context of cancer survivors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what sort of led you to pursue a PhD in this area?
Yeah, it's funny. At the age of 5, it's not like I thought I was going to be a cancer survivorship researcher. It's something that I fell into to a degree at the outset. I was really lucky to connect with some kind of world-leading researchers in that area when I was doing my honours project, and then when I'd finished that, the opportunity to work on a study focused on testicular cancer survivors came up. It wasn't something that I'd I guess particularly considered or focused on at that time, but I think as I started working on the project, I mean, I was working with a population of men who are not that dissimilar in age to myself. We really didn't know that much about what the issues that these men were facing were, and how we could possibly address them. So I think that really motivated me to just learn more about the area and see how we might be able to help those men.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like it's sort of put you on this path, towards looking at the mental health and psychological factors associated with cancer. So yeah, it sounds like even though you kind of fell into it, it's something that really sparked your interest over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess it really made me aware of, I guess, the mental health impacts that a disease like testicular cancer can have, and that may be surprising to some people. I mean, we've talked about the fact that it affects younger men, and I mean that is, I guess, one of the reasons why it can have such a significant impact. But these are men that primarily have a very good prognosis, in that they generally, will survive for a long period after being treated. And so, some people might think that, they or expect them just to kind of get on with life and get back to normal. But I guess what my research really showed was that, that's not necessarily the case. There are a large proportion of those men who do seem to adjust quite well after having testicular cancer, but there's a significant subset of those men who experience poorer mental health and who really need help beyond the end of their treatment to get their lives back on track.
Yeah, and I guess you've sort of touched on some of the findings from your PhD, but I'm just wondering, like, when you first started, what sort of questions were you hoping to answer, and how did you go about, conducting some of these studies?
Yeah, I guess there were three main points that we wanted to look at, or questions we wanted to answer. And the first were, there'd been a bit of work done primarily in the US and parts of Europe on testicular cancer survivors, but we really didn't know anything about men in the Australian context. So the first aim was to see how common the negative impacts on mental health and quality of life were in Australian testicular cancer survivors specifically. We also wanted to know, I guess, how severe those impacts were and what the biggest issues were that these men faced. And then thirdly, I guess because, as I mentioned, there's kind of a large group who seem to do quite well, but then a smaller group who experience poorer outcomes. So we wanted to try and look at factors that would help us identify who those men likely to experience poorer outcomes were, and also look at what we might be able to do to help them. And we, to address those different aims, there were two, I guess, main components to the research that I did. The first was a large nationwide survey of testicular cancer survivors. We had almost 250 in total from across the country, looking at their mental health and quality of life outcomes, and trying to establish, what factors helped predict better or worse outcomes in those domains. And then we also looked at their supportive care needs to give us an idea of what kind of support we could possibly offer them to address those issues. And we did some qualitative interviews with a group of survivors who seemed to be doing quite well, and another group who were struggling a bit, just to try and contrast their experiences to see, get a more in-depth understanding of what it was that was, I guess, causing the the men who were struggling to have that experience versus the ones who seem to be doing okay after treatment.
Yeah, well, it sounds like there were a lot of different components that you looked at in during your PhD, and I guess I'm wondering what were some of the key findings?
So we saw that I guess we looked at kind of both mental and physical impacts of testicular cancer in that survivorship phase, and certainly found that the mental impacts of testicular cancer were a lot more pronounced than the kind of physical impacts. Men seem to have quite similar physical kind of quality of life to other young men in the general population, but we did see greater prevalence of things like clinically significant anxiety and depression levels, and in this population, we know from both the research that we did and research more generally that anxiety is a particular issue, and fear of cancer recurrence as well. And that's I guess what first sparked my interest in this issue of fear of cancer recurrence, because it's really not something you'd expect that these men would suffer from. They have, as I mentioned, quite a good prognosis and quite a small risk of actually experiencing recurrence. But we know that even kind of 10 or more years post-treatment, these men are still frequently reporting concerns about their cancer coming back. And we know that we also documented other kind of common concerns, such as issues with their relationships and family, body image problems, and reduced sexual activity. And then in terms of identifying men at greatest risk, we found from both the kind of triangulated the quantitative findings from the survey with the qualitative work, and it seemed to be that those men who are younger, who didn't feel they were kind of well informed about testicular cancer, who experienced the whole diagnosis and treatment as a bit of a whirlwind, and those who are having kind of other issues such as job problems, who have fear of cancer recurrence and lower social support, tended to be at risk of poorer outcomes. And we also noted that people who, I guess, tended to take a more passive approach or avoidant approach to trying to address those issues tended to do more poorly than those who took a more active kind of problem solving approach. I guess that gave us some clues as to how we could possibly, or what interventions might be helpful in terms of addressing some of those outcomes, alongside the results from our survey of supportive care needs, which again kind of primarily related to things such as needing help to manage fear of cancer recurrence, and also dealing with relationship issues such as difficulties with their sex life. So I think we, I guess, got a sense of that. It was really the mental health of these men that was most impacted as opposed to their physical health, and got a sense of who it was that was most at risk and what some of the things were we could do to help them.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of things really came out of that research, and you kind of mentioned as well that it could kind of lead a way to design interventions to sort of help with this fear of the cancer coming back. So I'm just wondering, were there any positive implications that sort of came out of this study?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a few lessons that I learned and that hopefully useful more broadly. And the first is that I think it's important, at a system kind of level, that we don't assume that people who have good treatment outcomes and who are doing relatively well physically are necessarily coping well at a mental level. I mean, that's certainly what we saw, and I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of people would expect that these men are probably doing quite well, but that wasn't always the case. And we did, it may not have been obvious when I was kind of listing out the factors that helped us identify men at greatest risk, but there weren't, apart from kind of younger age, there weren't really any really obvious demographic or kind of clinical characteristics, so relating to the disease itself or the way it was treated, that could help us identify those men at greatest risk. So it's not like we could just say, it seems like all men who received chemotherapy, were at greater risk of poorer outcomes. So I think we need other ways of trying to identify those men at greater risk. And so that kind of suggests that things such as psychosocial screening, where you use very brief kind of survey instruments to assess things such as depression, anxiety, pain, fear of cancer recurrence, in a way that kind of flags it for the cancer care team to help assess further and manage, is important, because we can't necessarily know who the people are that are most at risk, or we don't know it at present. It may be that we kind of continue to build that profile. And I guess another thing that came out of the qualitative interviews in particular was that a lot of these men said they'd be kind of reluctant to maybe seek more conventional forms of treatment, such as going to speaking to a psychologist, face to face. So I think we need to develop kind of treatment models that are tailored to people's level of need, because not everybody might need such an intensive kind of type of intervention, but also that provide alternative ways of accessing mental health treatment. So apart from perhaps not needing such intensive intervention, there are other barriers such as the stigma of going to see a mental health professional, or if they live remotely, not being able to access that support. So I think we need to provide alternative means of getting help, and we ultimately, as leading on from my PhD work, developed an online psychological intervention, so a website essentially that enabled testicular cancer survivors to help themselves, get their lives back on track, or address some of the issues that they were facing after testicular cancer.
Yeah, well, yeah, it definitely sounds like, some positive things have come out of that initial research that sort of found that you've got this group of men who, even though they seem physically fine, their mental health might not be so great. So it's good that, some of these online interventions have kind of come out of that. And I really, appreciate hearing about your research today as well. And it's been, great, seeing the sort of outcomes that came out of that. So thank you. I think you might know already that many of our donations come out of the fundraising efforts from our Rotary clubs and districts across Australia. And I know that they're always interested to hear about the impact that their fundraising dollars have had. Could you tell our Rotary audience how the Ian Scott PhD scholarship may have helped your career personally, and if it's had any wider impact in the community?
Well, I think it's helped me and had a broader impact in several ways. I guess on a personal level, it enabled me to undertake this PhD with a world-leading group of researchers at the Psycho-Oncology Cooperative Research Group, and I think something that I'm hugely grateful for is that so that a lot of scholarships are offered to people who get particularly brilliant results in their honours year when they kind of finish their undergraduate research. I didn't get like kind of top marks in my honours year, but I think the process involved in the Ian Scott scholarship application included an interview where people, you got an opportunity to present your work and I guess show how important it was to you and how you felt like you could impact on that area. And I guess at a personal level, I really benefited from that. And I think it really enabled me and sparked my desire to address the needs of, I guess, under-researched populations, such as testicular cancer survivors, but also address issues that are, I guess, broadly experienced by cancer survivors, such as fear of cancer recurrence, and because the online or digital intervention was one of the kind of ways that or things that came out of this, that sparked several other interventions that I've worked on since, and I guess that one of the key things that I'm quite proud of is that ETC, the program to help, that online program that I mentioned to help men get back on track after cancer, is now publicly available thanks to support from the Australian, New Zealand Urogenital and Prostate Cancer Trials Group, or ANZUP. And I think that's why so many people do the kind of research that I do, is because they want to see it change practice and improve the lives of people living with cancer. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work out like that, or it can take a very long time to achieve that goal. But I'm really proud that this has ultimately led to something that's can help men in the real world. And I think with that it's, as I mentioned, kind of sparked that interest in fear of cancer recurrence, and we're working on online interventions to address that on a broader scale as well, and that could ultimately help millions of cancer survivors worldwide. It's one of the most commonly reported unmet needs in that group, and I think there's a real need to provide support that can be delivered at scale And I think that, this scholarship really set me down on that path and has enabled that work.
Yeah, well, it's definitely, really important work, and thank you for doing that kind of research as well. It's always good to kind of acknowledge that work that the researchers are doing behind the scenes to really, help the mental health of people, particularly with, a condition like cancer. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for joining me on the podcast today. It's been really great.
Oh, no worries. Thanks for having me. And thanks again to Australian Rotary Health for their support in the early stages of my career. And I hope I can continue to help improve the mental health of, people with cancer. And thanks for enabling me to do that.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you again. That was the 52nd episode of our podcast called The Research Behind Lift the Lid. It's always so inspiring to hear what researchers in Australia are doing to make a difference to mental health and how they are helping us on our mission to lift the lid on mental illness. If you can, please support important mental health research like Ben's by donating on the Australian Rotary Health website. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next time.